Some people are negative, critical, and judgmental. And sometimes those people go to church. When I was in my first pastorate, we had a lady in the church who took it upon herself to make a list of all the things I was doing wrong. And it was a handwritten list on 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper with one, critique on every line, and it was 4.5 pages long. Now, I don't know how many lines exactly that is, but suffice to say, there was at least 100, maybe, pushing 150 things. So, apparently I was a really bad pastor when I first started. And I remember some of the things on the list, even to this day, like I allowed our worship pastor to have long hair. I mean, it wasn't like Jesus hair or anything like that, although I don't know what would be wrong with that. His hair, it was the 80s, and he had a mullet, and his hair went like an inch or two below his collar. And, of course, the scripture says that men are not supposed to have long hair. I am apparently a really bad example as a husband and father because I do all the cooking in my home, and men are not supposed to cook, and I guess I've continued to be a bad husband and father throughout all of these years now, and we've been married 30 years, and I still do all the cooking in the home, so apparently I really fall short there. I'm a bad pastor because we owned our own home. Not like we owned it, the bank owned the home, but we had a mortgage on a little 3-bedroom home, and pastors are supposed to live in poverty. And so there's 4.5 pages of this stuff. And I'm wow, that's what I thought. She comes over, she's at the door, she knocks on the door, I just really felt like I needed to give you this. And so, I'm just completely blown away. And I'm devastated. I'm a 25-year-old rookie pastor, and I thought my world had ended. I was so crushed that I was just going to leave ministry. And my former pastor, the pastor of the sponsoring church that had sent us out, and who's also just one of my best friends and my mentor, he had to talk me off the ledge. I'm on the phone with him for like 3 hours one afternoon, just not knowing what I'm going to do. It's funny, isn't it, how Christians can be so negative sometimes, so critical and so judgmental. And I say that because this is certainly not what Jesus taught or what he modeled for us. In fact, Jesus taught just the opposite. And in our journey through the Sermon on the Mount, that's what we're doing. We're going through the Sermon on the Mount. And we come to this section now where Jesus is talking about this very subject. He's talking about judgmentalism in the context of, again, the Sermon on the Mount, which is what it looks like to be a kingdom citizen. He is describing in these series of teachings, how Christians are to behave. This is what my followers are supposed to look like. And he then begins talking about this subject, judgmentalism. And so I pick it up in chapter 7, starting in verse 1. And he says, "Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." This is the ethic of Jesus. This is what it looks like to be a citizen of the kingdom. When we follow the king, this is what it's supposed to be like. In other words, when the kingdom is manifested in our lives, this is how we show it to others. This is a little bit of conjecture here, but by being positive, and we'll get to that in a minute, but positive, encouraging, uplifting, not harsh and critical and negative and judgmental. And this is a hard word for us today because it seems like everybody's a critic. It's just the spirit and tone of our society. I mean, all of us at one time or another have been guilty of being critical and judgmental towards, someone else. And what Jesus is saying is that we need to be very, very careful with that. And especially here in the South, just because you say bless their heart after something doesn't mean that what you said was okay. And so what Jesus is saying is that my people shouldn't judge. Don't do it. It's wrong. Stop it. That this is not who we are. This is not how we're supposed to behave. And in the context of the larger Sermon on the Mount, which we'll get to, he's saying, this is where this is going. This is how we treat other people. This is how we relate to other people. And we are not judgmental. And I almost feel the need to stop here and even explain because of, again, the contemporary mindset and the way that we are and the way that we think as Christians. Because we're looking out at the world today and we're saying, look at all these people, Lord. Look at all the crazy stuff that people are doing. Look at how destructive and self-destructive people are. People need to hear the truth. They need to see the light. They need someone to tell them. And so don't we need to be that light? Don't we need to be that voice, showing the world where they're wrong? And I would say that there's a fine line between being prophetic and then being judgmental. And we have to know where that line is, and we have to stay on the right side of it. It's very important because this is where the world is today, isn't it? I mean, how relevant is this topic today that Jesus is addressing like 2,000 years ago? Maybe he, knew where his followers would be and some of the things that we would struggle with. But everything I'm hearing is, you just kind of put your ear to the wind out there, and what's going on and out in culture and what people are saying is over and over. It's just how judgmental Christians are. And that's what people are hearing. And that's the way they think we are. And anymore, it's not even an argument. They just say it as if it's a given. If you're a Christian, then you are a judgmental person. And how tragic that is what we are known for. How tragic. That's the first word that comes to someone's mind when they hear the word Christian. And I didn't grow up Christian. I grew up in San Francisco, in a very secular culture. And when somebody mentioned Christians to me, that's one of the first things that I thought of. And it should not be that way. The first thing that should come to people's mind when they hear the word Christian is grace, love, peace, mercy. Those are the things that we should be known for. And that's certainly consistent with what Jesus is talking about here. And so he's saying, do not judge. And this whole other issue, about the difference between judging and not judging and proclaiming truth, we're going to talk about that next week and when we get to verse 6. But today I want to lay out the baseline of what Jesus is talking about, and it's this ethic of not being judgmental people. And so as we're laying out that baseline, it's really important for us to ask the why question here. Because if we really do struggle with this as believers, and this is really where the world is trying to ding us, then we really need to have an understanding of why we don't want to do this and why we don't want to be this way or come across this way. And if we understand the why question, then maybe that will help us be more aware as we're out there and we're talking with people about how we're coming across and how we're phrasing things. And maybe we can even communicate some of the same things that we're trying to communicate, but do so in a non-judgmental way. But we do not want to be judgmental people. I think the first reason, and this sounds a little circular, so I'll try and back it up a little bit. I think one of the first reasons why we don't want to be judgmental or we don't want to judge is because it's simply contrary to God's will. And again, I said that sounds a little circular, and even the first point here will sound that as well. You say, well, what do you mean by that? It's just a statement. Again, do not judge. Don't do it. Stop it. Don't be that way. And, why does Jesus say that? Well, I think there's probably some reasons behind that. First of all, I think that it's contrary to the Spirit of Christ that's in our heart. Again, we're talking about the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus starts out with the Beatitudes. He talks about humility, meekness, peace, righteousness. That doesn't fit with being critical. That doesn't fit with being judgmental. It doesn't fit with being that negative person that's in your face. That's not humble. That's not meek. That's not righteous. That's not merciful. That's not peaceable. Christ desires that we be loving, patient, forgiving, forbearing, gentle, kind people. He desires that we exude love, mercy, and grace in our lives. This is who we are. This is our ethic. This is the message of the kingdom, the message that we are to embody. And this is the message of the major teachings of the New Testament. From right here in the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount, to the fruit of the Spirit, to the Great Commandment, to the love chapter in 1 Corinthians 13, to the 100 plus one another's in the Scriptures of love one another, pray for one another, admonish one another, encourage one another, etc. You go through the major teachings of the Bible, and you will see that the ethic is love, mercy, grace, etc., not being harsh, negative, critical, and judgmental. And so I think one reason why Jesus may have just flat out said this is wrong, don't do it, it's contrary to God's will, is because it's contrary to the Spirit of Christ that lives in us and that we are to embody and show to the world. I think another reason why Jesus may have said this is that only God is qualified to judge. And this is a sentiment that we find throughout Scripture in many different places. I'll just give you one example. In James 4:12, we read, "There's only one lawgiver and judge, the one who is able to save and destroy. But you, who are you to judge your neighbor?" The thing about judging people and judging others, regardless of who they are, whether they're a Christian or not a Christian or whatever, is that we really personally have no idea what's going on inside that person's head or what's going on inside that person's heart. And we think we know. Like, we look at people, we all do this. We size people up. We look at them and, oh, they're struggling with this, and they said this, and they're doing this. And so we're going to make assumptions about that person. And you know what? We are frequently wrong. Most people are very sincerely trying to live out their worldview, whatever that worldview happens to be. They're doing the best that they can. And we always want to imply all sorts of motive and this and that. And we are frequently wrong. The only person who is genuinely qualified to judge another person's heart is God, because He's the only one who truly knows what's going on inside that heart. Furthermore, He knows that person better than they even know themselves. But when we presume to judge another person, we are now placing ourselves in the place of God. And we don't want to be there. That's why Jesus says, "Judge not, lest you too be judged." And frankly, I'm not comfortable being in that position where God is saying that about me. And so only God is qualified to judge. I think another reason why Jesus may have said this is because judgmentalism hurts people, or criticism, it hurts people, and it tears people down. Jesus even had to deal with this. Jesus, the very Son of God incarnate, God in the flesh, perfectly righteous in every way, was criticized harshly and was run down by others, including the religious establishment. For example, in Matthew 9:11, He was criticized for eating with tax collectors and sinners. In Matthew 12:12, he was criticized for picking grain on the Sabbath. In Matthew 15:2, he was criticized for not washing his hands before he ate. In Mark 2:7, he was criticized for blasphemy because he forgave sins. In Luke 19:7, he was criticized for going to Zacchaeus' house because he was a sinner. In John 4:61, he was criticized for calling himself the bread of life. And so apparently, Jesus did not live up to the expectations and the spirituality of all of those around him. Now, let me ask you this. Do you think Jesus heard those criticisms? Absolutely, he did. He heard them loud and clear. And how do you think that made Jesus feel? Remember, he is fully God, but he's also fully human. And being human, I guarantee you, that made him feel terrible. When people come at you with harshness, when people come at you in that way, tearing you down, I guarantee you that it hurts every single time, especially from those that you are trying to help or those that he was trying to help. And so sometimes we think we're doing good. I'm sure that woman in my church when I was a rookie pastor, she thought that she was doing something really good. She thought she was helping me, but she hurt me a great deal when she did that. And some of us, again, we're these self-proclaimed critics, and we don't realize the impact and the effect that we're having on the lives of other people. And so why did Jesus come out and say this? I mean, do not judge. Is it because it doesn't embody the ethic that he's trying to teach in the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount? Or is it because only God is qualified to judge? Or is it because it's hurtful and it tears other people down? I don't know. Honestly, personally, I suspect it's probably all of those and then a whole bunch of other things that I didn't think of. But the bottom line is that being a judgmental person, a judgmental spirit, a critical spirit, is contrary to the will of God in our lives. I think another reason why we are not supposed to judge, and as we begin to go through the text here, is that it brings negative consequences in our lives. If you read on in verses 1 and 2, it says, "Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you." So we're going to be judged in the same way and with the same measure that we judge other people. Guys, that scares me to death. Because I am well aware of the lack of understanding and patience and grace that I have demonstrated to other people in my life at one time or another. And if that's the measure God is going to use with me, then I am absolutely sunk. Now, I do have a question of this part of the text, and that is, what is Jesus talking about here? Is he talking about man's judgment, or is he talking about God's judgment? Is he talking about the consequences that come in our lives, with being a judgmental person in the context of our relationship with other people? Or is he talking about, the measure that God is going to use or the criteria that God is going to use in judging us? And I honestly believe that it may be some of both here. Because the truth of the matter is that harsh people, critical people, judgmental people, negative people are not very well thought of. People don't think kindly of them. I mean, do you like being around people like that? I don't. I mean, nobody likes them. Nobody wants to be around them. And of course, I'm speaking generally. And generally speaking, such people tend to isolate themselves and live very lonely, disappointing lives. Because again, people don't want to be around them. Just think Ebenezer Scrooge. He's this harsh person. He's this porcupine personality. He's so prickly that nobody can get close to him. And so everybody wants to give them space. Everybody wants to back up. And again, those people just tend to be very lonely, alienated people. But then the context of the passage, straight up indicates that this is talking perhaps about Judgment Day. And in how we judge others, we too are going to be judged. This is the measure that God is going to use for us. And to be honest with you, this just heaps all kinds of extra condemnation upon us. Because now, not only are we going to be judged by God's perfect standard of righteousness, now we will also, on top of that, be judged by our own impossible standards as well. And basically what that says to me is that our own judgmentalism just leaves us much further in debt of God's grace and mercy. There's a poem that I believe wonderfully illustrates both sides of this, how our own judgmentalism leaves us in poor regard with other people, and how it leaves us further in need of God's mercy and grace. And the poem is called "I Dreamed of Heaven." And it's an old poem, and I've heard preachers use it over the years, and I'm usually not into such, some of the kind of cliche kind of things, but I think this really does drive home that point in a very cool way. And it reads like this: I dreamed death came the other night, and heaven's gates swung wide. With kindly grace, an angel ushered me inside. And there, to my astonishment, stood folks I'd known on earth. Some I judged and labeled unfit or of little worth. Indignant words rose to my lips, but never were set free. For every face showed stunned surprise. No one expected me. Judgmentalism leads us to a bad place as believers. It has negative consequences in our lives. And I think the point that Jesus is making, it has negative consequences in our relationship with man, and it has negative consequences in our relationship with God. I think another reason why Jesus is saying do not judge others, or he's speaking about not being a judgmental person, and that is that judgmentalism distorts our view of other people. He says, starting in verse 3, why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank, I like the way the King James puts that, the log in your brother's own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? Guys, a critical and judgmental spirit can easily descend into fantasy land. Once someone becomes jaundiced in your view, once somebody kind of passes that threshold where you no longer respect them, when you begin to look at them in that way, now you're hypersensitive to everything they're all about. And everything they do and say is looked at in a certain way, and you see the bad in just about every situation. I'll give you, for instance, John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist Church, struggled with a spirit of criticism. And in one of his writings, he was talking about a businessman in his church that he thought was greedy and cheap because he gave such little offerings. And he thought that this guy with the stature that he had should, be much more generous with his money. And Wesley recounts how one day he just blew up at the guy. And in his own words, he said, blistered him over and over with blistering condemnation. And after he did that, Wesley said the man very respectfully and humbly explained that he felt he needed to pay back the serious debts that he had incurred prior to his conversion. And that he held back only a very small stipend for himself, most of which he gave to the church, holding back only a penny a week. And he would go to the market and he would buy a penny's worth of parsnips every week and boil them down, and that's what he would eat. And then he reassured Wesley that once my debts are paid off, you can bet that I will be giving much more money to the church. Wesley said it was that encounter that began to really open his eyes to his own critical spirit and how he needed to do something about that because it changed the way that he looked at people. Judgmentalism not only distorts the way we look at others, but it also distorts the way we look at ourselves. Because when we're so busy looking at everyone else's problems, we become very self-righteous. And we become, thinking that we're all that. And that, we're really something spiritually, and other people, well, they just don't quite measure up, do they? And that's what this whole plank and speck thing is about. Have any of you ever had a splinter in your eye? Just a piece of wood or a speck. But like a real something in your eye. It's like stop the world, isn't it? You can't do anything. Like if you're driving, you have to pull over. You can't read, you can't talk to someone. You're buckled over and you got your finger in your eye. Whatever you got to do, to get that splinter out of your eye. But if someone else were to see you, they would look at you and they would say, what's wrong? Because they don't see it. You feel like you have this plank in your eye. You feel like you have a huge log in your eye because it has shut down your world. But they're looking at you going, what's wrong? And you say, I got something in my eye. And they're like, well, I don't see it. Because it's small. It's just this little speck. And even if they come over and look, it's going to be hard for them to find. They have to get in just the right light. You know how people do. They stick their fingers in your eye and they pull it open and they're looking everywhere. And maybe then they can find that speck. And what Jesus is saying is that we all have specks in our eyes. We all have problems. None of us are perfect. It's the result of the fall. It's just who we are. We are an imperfect race. And so we all have these things in our eye. And he's saying, look, you need to clean up your own house first. You need to get all of those, splinters out of your own eye before you can start, criticizing and pulling them out of other people's eyes. So what's Jesus trying to say? What he's trying to say is that we are usually much more gracious and tolerant with our own sins than we are with other people's sins. That it's so much easier for us to see the problems in everybody else's life than it is to see the problems in our own life. And it's real easy to be a critic, isn't it? It's real easy to be a backseat driver or what have you without really understanding who that person is and what's going on in their lives, and more importantly, what's going on in their heart. And who knows that? God does. Let God deal with that issue in that individual's life. But some of us are walking around like, you know what? I don't have any problems. Man, I got it all together. I'm spiritually, I'm superior. I'm better than you. An Englishman was driving through the Alps one time in a Rolls Royce, and he barreled into this corner really hard, and he broke a spring. It's a true story. Can't remember the guy's name, so he's an Englishman. So he barrels into this corner, and he breaks the spring on the front chassis of his Rolls Royce. So he takes it to the mechanic and he gets it fixed. And when he gets his bill, he sees that there's no price for the spring. He wasn't charged for the spring. And so being an honest man, he goes to the mechanic and he says, hey, I think you made a mistake. There's no price here for the spring. And the mechanic says, no, there's no mistake. Rolls Royce did not charge for the spring. And so he called up Rolls-Royce. And he spoke to a representative who denied all knowledge of the transaction. And the man, I would have just hung up at that point. But the man, just kept pushing it. And finally, the representative on the phone said this, and I quote, "Sir, we are Rolls-Royce. Our springs do not break." All right, that's how a lot of Christians are. I'm a Christian. My springs do not break. I'm a Christian. I don't have any problems. And even when they do have problems, I still don't have any problems. And isn't it funny how it's those same people who are so gracious with themselves who tend to be the harshest and the most critical and the most judging of other people? The ones who are so easy on themselves tend to be the harshest on other people, thinking, I don't do anything wrong. I don't have any problems. I have my whole life together. And if we've learned anything from reading the Sermon on the Mount and the ethic and the spirituality that Jesus wants us to embrace and to embody and show to the world, it's the opposite of that attitude. The very opposite. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of God. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness' sake. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are the merciful. Blessed are the pure in heart. It's like the opposite of that arrogant, superior, critical, negative, judgmental spirit. In the foreword of Brennan Manning's book, The Ragamuffin Gospel, he tells who the book is for. And I believe he does a really good job capturing the tone of how we are to present ourselves as believers, the tone of which we're to carry ourselves, even in our own minds and our own hearts. And I want to share it with you. He writes, the Ragamuffin Gospel was written with a specific reading audience in mind. This book is not for the super spiritual. It's not for the muscular Christians who have made John Wayne and not Jesus their hero. It's not for the academics who would imprison Jesus in ivory towers of exegesis. It's not for the noisy, feel-good folks who manipulate Christianity into a naked appeal for emotion. It is not for the hooded mystics who want magic in their religion. It's not for the Alleluia Christians who live only on the mountaintop and have never visited the valley of desolation. It is not for the fearless and tearless. It is not for the red-hot zealots who boast with the rich young ruler of the Gospels, all these commandments I have kept from my youth. It is not for the complacent who hoist over their shoulders a tote bag of honors, diplomas, and good works, actually believing they have made it. It is not for the legalists who would rather surrender control of their souls to rules than run the risk of living in union with Jesus. If anyone is still reading along, the Ragamuffin Gospel was written for the bedraggled, beaten up, and burnt out. It is for the sorely burdened who are still shifting the heavy suitcase from one hand to the other. It is for the wobbly and weak-kneed who know they don't have it all together and are too proud to accept the handout of amazing grace. It is for the inconsistent, unsteady disciples whose cheese is falling off their cracker. It is for the poor, weak, sinful men and women with hereditary faults and limited talents. It is for earthen vessels who shuffle along on feet of clay. It is for the bent and the bruised who feel that their lives are a grave disappointment to God. It is for smart people who know they are stupid and honest disciples who know they are scallywags. The Ragamuffin Gospel is a book I wrote for myself and anyone who has grown weary and discouraged along the way. This tone, this spirit of honesty and humility, you will not find with the self-righteous and the proud and the spiritually arrogant. The ones who feel that it is their calling in life to sit above everyone else and point out how everyone else is falling short. But it is an attitude and it is a tone that you will find in the more humble followers of Jesus. The ones who somehow have it in their heart and in their mind and in their heads that to be a follower of Jesus is to look like Jesus and to learn from him and be like him. And I hope that as we work through these teachings here in the Sermon on the Mount, I hope that as we wrestle and as we struggle to try and emulate our master, to try and be like him, knowing that we're going to fall down time and again. But I hope that we learn this, And that it is possible to be prophetic. And again, we'll talk about this next week. And it's possible to be a light, and it's possible to share the good news without coming off like a condescending jerk. It is possible for us to be humble and honest and righteous and about mercy and peace and grace and to love people and demonstrate forgiveness. It is possible to be a Christian without being judgmental and critical. And may we all take these words of Jesus to heart, that we might represent him well as we go into our neighborhoods and our workplaces and our schools or wherever else the Lord may take us.